Chapter 26, in which a mysterious character appears upon the scene, and many things inseparable from this history are done and performed. The old man gained the street corner before he began to recover the effect of Toby Crackett's intelligence. He had relaxed nothing of his unusual speed, but was still pressing onward in the same wild and disordered manner, when the sudden dashing past of a carriage, and a boisterous cry from the foot-passengers, who saw his danger, drove him back upon the pavement. Avoiding as much as possible all the main streets, and skulking only through the byways and alleys, he had emerged on Snow Hill. Here he walked even faster than before, nor did he linger until he had again turned into a court, when, as if conscious that he was now in his proper element, fell into the usual shuffling pace and seemed to breathe more freely. Near to the spot where Snow Hill and Holborn Hill meet, opens, upon the right hand as you come out to the city, a narrow and dismal alley leading to Saffron Hill. In its filthy shops are exposed for sale huge bunches of second-hand silk handkerchiefs, of all sizes and patterns, for here reside the traders who purchase them from pickpockets. Hundreds of these handkerchiefs hang dangling from the pegs outside the windows, or flaunting from the door-posts, and the shelves within are piled with them. Confined as the limits of Field Lane are, it has a barber, its coffee shop, its beer shop, and its fried fish warehouse. It is a commercial colony of itself, the emporium of petty larceny, visited at early morning and setting in of dusk by silent merchants who traffic in dark back parlours, and who go as strangely as they come. Here the clothesman, the shoe vamper, and the rag merchant display their goods, as signboards to the petty thief here, stores of old iron and bones, and heaps of mildewy fragments of woolen stuff and linen rust and rot in the grimy cellars. It was into this place that the Jew turned. He was well known to the sallow denizens of the lane, for such of them as were on the lookout to buy and sell nodded familiarly as he passed along. He replied to their salutations in the same way, but bestowed no closer recognition until he reached the further end of the alley, when he stopped to address a salesman of small stature, who had squeezed as much of his person into a child's chair as the chair would hold, and was smoking a pipe at the warehouse door. "What a sight of you, Fagin, could cure the hoptelmy," said this respectable trader, in acknowledgment of the Jew's inquiry after his health. "The neighbourhood was a little too hot lively," said Fagin, elevating his eyebrows and crossing his hands upon his shoulders. "Well, I've heard that complaint of it once or twice before," replied the trader. "But it soon cools down again, don't you find it so?" Fagin nodded in the affirmative. Pointing in the direction of Saffron Hill, he inquired whether anyone was up yonder tonight. "At the Cripples?" inquired the man. The Jew nodded. "Let me see," pursued the merchant, reflecting. "Yes, there's some half-dozen of 'em gone in, that I knows. I don't think your friend's there." "Sykes is not, I suppose?" inquired the Jew with a disappointed countenance. "Not as Winters, as the lawyers say," replied the little man, shaking his head and looking amazingly sly. "Have you got anything in my line tonight?" "Nothing tonight," said the Jew, turning away. "Are you going up to the Cripples, Fagin?" cried the little man, calling after him. "Stop! I don't mind if I have a drop there with you." But as the Jew, looking back, waved his hand to intimate that he preferred being alone, and moreover, as the little man could not very easily disengage himself from the chair, the sign of the Cripples was, for a time, the bereft of advantage of Mr. Lively's presence. By the time he had got upon his legs, the Jew had disappeared. So Mr. Lively, after ineffectually standing on tiptoe, in the hope of catching sight of him, again forced himself into the little chair, and, exchanging a shake of the head with the lady in the opposite shop, in which doubt and mistrust were plainly mingled, resumed his pipe with a grave demeanour. The Three Cripples, or rather the Cripples, which was the sign by which the establishment was familiarly known to his patrons, was the public house in which Mr. Sykes and his dog have already figured. Merely making a sign to a man at the bar, Fagin walked straight upstairs, and opening the door of a room, and softly insinuating himself into the chamber, looked anxiously about, shading his eyes with his hand, as if to search for some particular person. The room was illuminated by 2 gas-lights, the glare of which was prevented by the barred shutters and closely drawn curtains in faded red from being visible outside. The ceiling was blackened to prevent its colour from being injured by the flaring of the lamps, and the place was so full of tobacco smoke that at first it was scarcely possible to discern anything more. By degrees, however, as some of it cleared away through the open door, an assemblage of heads as confused as the noises that greeted the ear might be made out, and as the eye grew more accustomed to the scene, the spectator gradually became aware of the presence of a numerous company, male and female, crowded around the long table, at the upper end of which sat a chairman with a hammer of office in his hand, while a professional gentleman with a bluish nose and his face tied up for the benefit of a toothache presided at the jingling piano in the remote corner. As Fagin stepped softly in, the professional gentleman, running over the keys as way of a prelude, occasioned a general cry of order for a song, which having subsided, a young lady proceeded to entertain the company with a ballad in 4 verses, between each of which the accompanist played the melody all through as loud as he could. When this was over, the chairman gave a sentiment, after which the professional gentleman on the chairman's right and left volunteered a duet and sang it with great applause. It was curious to observe some faces which stood out prominently from among the group. There was the chairman himself, the landlord of the house, a coarse, rough, heavily built fellow who, while the songs were proceeding, rolled his eyes hither and thither, and, seeming to give himself up to joviality, had an eye for everything that was done, and an ear for everything that was said, and sharp ones too. Near him were the singers, receiving with professional indifference the compliments of the company, and applying themselves, in turn, to a dozen proffered glasses of spirits and water, tended by their most boisterous admirers, whose countenances, expressive of almost every vice and almost every grade, irresistibly attracted the attention by their very repulsiveness. Cunning, ferocity, and drunkenness in all of its stages were there, in their strongest aspect, and women, some of with the last lingering tinge of their early freshness almost fading as you looked, others with every mark and stamp of their sex utterly beaten out, and presenting but one loathsome blank of profligacy and crime, some mere girls, others but young women, and none past the prime of life, formed the darkest and saddest portion of this dreary picture. Fagin, troubled by no grave emotions, looked eagerly from face to face while these proceedings were in progress, but apparently without meeting that of which he was in search. Succeeding at length in catching the eye of the man who occupied the chair, he beckoned to him slightly, and left the room as quietly as he entered it. "What can I do for you, Mr. Fagin?" inquired the man, as he followed him out to the landing. "Won't you join us? They'll be delighted, every one of them." The Jew shook his head impatiently, and said in a whisper, "Is he here?" "No," replied the man. "And no news of Barney?" inquired Fagin. "None," replied the landlord of the Cripples, for it was he. "He won't stir until it's safe, depend on it. They're on the scent down there, and if he moved, he'd blow upon the thing at once. He's all right enough, Barney is, else I should have heard of him. I'll pound it that Barney managing properly, let him alone for that." "Will he be here tonight?" asked the Jew, laying some emphasis on the pronoun as before. "Monks, you mean?" inquired the landlord, hesitating. "Hush," said the Jew. "Yes." "Certain," replied the man, drawing a gold watch from his fob. "I expected him here before now. If you wait 10 minutes, he'll be—" "No," said the Jew hastily, as though, however desirous he might be to see the person in question, he was nevertheless relieved by his absence. "Tell him that I came here to see him, and that he must come to me tonight. No, say tomorrow. As he is not here, tomorrow will be time enough." "Good," said the man. "Nothing more?" "Not a word now," said the Jew, descending the stairs. "I say," said the other, looking over the rails and speaking in a hoarse whisper, "what time this would be for a sell? I got Phil Barker here, so drunk that a boy might take him." "Ah, but it's not Phil Barker's time," said the Jew, looking up. "Phil has something more to do before we can afford to part with him. So go back to the company, my dear, and tell him to lead merry lives while they last." The landlord reciprocated the old man's laugh, and returned to his guests. The Jew was no sooner alone than his countenance resumed its former expression of anxiety and thought. After a brief reflection, he called a hack cabriolet, and bade the man drive towards Bethnal Green. He dismissed him within some quarter of a mile from Mr. Sykes' residence, and performed the short remainder of the distance on foot. "Now," muttered the Jew as he knocked on the door, "if there's any deep play here, I shall have it out with you, my girl, as cunning as you are." She was in her room, the woman said. Fagin crept softly upstairs, and entered it without any previous ceremony. The girl was alone, lying with her head upon her table, and her hair straggling over it. "She's been drinking," thought the Jew coolly, "or perhaps she is only miserable." The old man turned to close the door as he made his reflection, and the noise thus occasioned roused the girl. She eyed his crafty face narrowly, as she inquired to his recital of Toby Crackett's story. When it was concluded, she sank into her former attitude, but spoke not a word. She pushed her candle impatiently away, and once or twice, as she feverishly changed her position, shuffled her feet upon the ground, but that was all. During the silence, the Jew looked restlessly about the room, as if to assure himself that there were no appearances of Sykes having covertly returned. Apparently satisfied with his inspection, he coughed once or twice, and made as many efforts to open the conversation, but the girl heeded him no more than if he had been made of stone. At length he made another attempt, and rubbing his hands together, said in his most conciliatory tone, "And where do you think Bill was now, my dear?" The girl moaned out some half-intelligible reply that she could not tell, and seemed, from the smothered noise that escaped her, to be crying. "And the boy, too," said the Jew, straining his eyes to catch a glimpse of her face. "Poor little child, left in a ditch, Nance. Only think." "The child," said the girl, suddenly looking up, "is better where he is than among us, and if no harm comes to Bill from it, I hope he's dead in a ditch, and that his young bones may rot there." "What?" cried the Jew in amazement. I do," returned the girl, meeting his gaze. "I shall be glad to have him away from my eyes, and to know that the worst is over. I can't bear to have him about me. The sight of him turns me against myself and all of you." "Pooh," said the Jew scornfully. "You're drunk." Am I? Cried the girl bitterly. "It's no fault of yours that I'm not. You'll never have me anything else, and if you had your will except now, the humour doesn't suit you, doesn't it?" "No," rejoined the Jew furiously, "it does not." "Change it, then," responded the girl with a laugh. "Change it!" exclaimed the Jew, exasperated beyond all bounds by his companion's unexpected obstinacy and the vexation of the night. "I will change it. Listen to me, you drab. Listen to me, who with 6 words can strangle Sykes as surely as if I had his bull's throat between my fingers now. If he comes back, and he leaves a boy behind him, if he gets off free and dead or alive, fails to restore him to me, murder him yourself if you would have him escape, Jack Ketch. And do it the moment he sets foot in this room, or mind me, it'll be too late." "What is all this?" cried the girl involuntarily. "What is it?" pursued Fagin, mad with rage. "When the boy's worth hundreds of pounds to me, am I to lose the chance that threw me in the way of getting safely, through the whims of a drunken gang, that I could whistle away the lives of? And me bound to a born devil that only wants will, and has the power to... Panting for breath, the old man stammered for a word, and in the instant checked the torrent of his wrath, and changed his whole demeanour. A moment before his clenched hands had grasped the air, his eyes dilated, and his face grown livid with passion, but now he shrunk into a chair, and, cowering together, trembled with the apprehension of having himself disclosed some hidden villainy. After a short silence, he ventured to look round at his companion. He appeared somewhat reassured, on beholding her in the same listless attitude from which he had first roused her. "Nancy, dear," croaked the Jew in his usual voice, "did you mind me, dear?" "Don't worry me now, Fagin," replied the girl, raising her head languidly. "If Bill had not done it this time, he will another. He has done many a good job for you, and will do many more when he can. And when he can't, he won't, so no more about that." "Regarding the boy, my dear," said the Jew, rubbing the palms of his hands nervously together. "The boy must take his chance with the rest," interrupted Nancy hastily. "And I say again, I hope he is dead, and out of harm's way, and out of yours. That is, if Bill comes to no harm. And if Toby got clear off, Bill's pretty sure to be safe, for Bill's worth 2 of Toby any time." "And about what I was saying, my dear," observed the Jew, keeping his glistening eyes steadily upon her. "You must say it all over again, if it's anything you want me to do," rejoined Nancy. "And if it is, you had better wait till tomorrow. You put me up for a minute, but now I'm stupid again." Fagin put several other questions, all with the same drift of ascertaining whether that girl had profited by his unguarded hints, but she answered him so readily, and was withal so utterly unmoved by his searching looks, that his original impression of her being more than a trifle in liquor was confirmed. Nancy, indeed, was not exempt from a failing which was very common among the Jew's female pupils, and in which, in her tenderer years, they were rather encouraged than checked. Her disordered appearance, and a wholesale perfume of Geneva which pervaded the apartment, offered strong confirmatory evidence of the justice of the Jew's supposition, and when, after indulging in the temporary display of violence above described, she subsided, first into dullness and afterwards into a compound of feelings, under the influence of which she shed tears one minute, and in the next gave utterance of various exclamations of "never say die," and divers calculations as to what might be the amount of odds, so long as a lady or gentleman was happy. Mr. Fagin, who had had considerable experience of such matters at his time, saw with great satisfaction that she was very gone indeed. Having eased his mind by this discovery, and having accomplished his twofold object of imparting to the girl what he had that night heard, and of ascertaining with his own eyes that Sikes had not returned, Mr. Fagin then turned his face homeward, leaving his young friend asleep with her head upon the table. It was within an hour of midnight. The weather being dark and piercing cold, he had no great temptation to loiter. The sharp wind had scoured the streets, seemed to have cleared them of passengers as of dust and mud, for few people were abroad, and they were to all appearance hastening fast home. It blew from the right quarter of the Jew, however, and straight before it he went, trembling and shivering as every fresh gust blew him rudely on his way. He had reached the corner of his own street, and was already fumbling in his pocket for the door-key, when a dark figure emerged from a projecting entrance which lay deep in shadow, and, crossing the road, glided up to him unperceived. "Fagin," whispered a voice close to his ear. "Ah," said the Jew, turning quickly round. "Is that—" "Yes," interrupted the stranger. "I have been lingering here these 2 hours. Where the devil have you been?" "On your business, my dear," replied the Jew, glancing uneasily at his companion and slackening his pace as he spoke. "On your business all night." "Oh, of course," said the stranger with a sneer. "Well, and what's come of it?" "Nothing good," said the Jew. "Nothing bad, I hope," said the stranger, stopping short and turning a startled look on his companion. The Jew shook his head, and was about to reply when the stranger, interrupting him, motioned to the house, before which they had by this time arrived, remarking that he had better say what he had got to say under cover, for his blood was chilled with standing about so long, and the wind blew through him. Fagin looked as if he would have willingly excused himself from taking home a visitor at that unseasonable hour, and indeed muttered something about having no fire, but his companion repeating his request in a peremptory manner, he unlocked the door, and requested him to close it softly while he got a light. "It's as dark as the grave," said the man, groping forward a few steps. "Make haste." "Shut the door," whispered Fagin from the end of the passage. As he spoke, it closed with a loud noise. "That wasn't my doing," said the other man, feeling his way. "The wind blew to it, or it shut of its own accord, one or the other. Look sharp at the light, or I shall knock my brains out against something in this confounded hole." Fagin stealthily descended the kitchen stairs. After a short absence, he returned with a lighted candle and intelligence that Toby Crackit was asleep in the back room below, and that the boys were in the front one. Beckoning the man to follow him, he led his way upstairs. "We can say the few words we've got to say in here, my dear," said the Jew, throwing open a door on the first floor. "And as there are holes in the shutters, and we never show lights to our neighbours, we'll set the candle on the stairs there." With these words, the Jew, stooping down, placed the candle on the upper flight of stairs, exactly opposite from the room door. That done, he led the way into the apartment, which was destitute of all movables save a broken armchair and an old couch or sofa without covering, which stood behind the door. Upon this piece of furniture the stranger sat himself with the air of a weary man, and the Jew, drawing up the armchair opposite, they sat face to face. It was not quite dark. The door was partially open, and the candle outside threw a feeble reflection on the opposite wall. They conversed for some time in whispers, although nothing of the conversation was distinguishable beyond a few disjointed words here and there. A listener might easily have perceived that Fagin appeared to be defending himself against some remarks of the stranger, and the latter was in a state of considerable irritation. They might have been talking thus for a quarter of an hour or more, when Monks, by which name the Jew had designated the strange man several times in the course of their colloquy, said, raising his voice a little, "I tell you it was badly planned. Why not have kept him here among the rest, and made a sneaking, snivelling pickpocket of him at once?" "Only hear him!" exclaimed the Jew, shrugging his shoulders. "Why, you mean to say you couldn't have done it had you chosen?" demanded Monks sternly. "Haven't you done it with other boys scores of times? If you had had the patience for a 12-month at most, couldn't you have got him convicted and sent him safely out of the kingdom, perhaps for life?"
"Whose turn would that have served, my dear?" inquired the Jew humbly. "Mine," replied Monks. "But not mine," said the Jew submissively. "He might have become of use to me. When there are two parties in a bargain, it is only reasonable that the interests of both should be consulted, is it, my good friend?" "What then?" demanded Monks. "I saw it was not easy to train him in the business," replied the Jew. "He was not like the other boys in the same circumstances." "Curse him, no," muttered the man, "or he would have been a thief a long time ago." "I had no hold upon him to make him worse," pursued the Jew, anxiously watching the countenance of his companion. "His hand was not in. I had nothing to frighten him with, which we always must have in the beginning, or we labour in vain. What could I do? Send him out with the Dodger and Charlie? We had enough of that at first, my dear. I trembled for us all." "That was not my doing," observed Monk. "No, no, my dear," renewed the Jew. "And I don't quarrel with it now, because if it had never happened, you might never have clapped eyes on the boy to notice him, and so led the discovery that it was him you were looking for. Well, I got him back for you by means of a girl, and then she begins to favour him." "Follow the girl," said Monks impatiently. "Why, we can't afford to do that just now, my dear," replied the Jew, smiling. "And besides, that sort of thing is not our way, or one of these days I might be glad to have it done. I know what these girls are, Monks, well. As soon as the boy begins to harden, she'll care no more for him than for a block of wood. You want him made a thief. If he is alive, I can make him one for his time, and if, said the Jew, drawing near to the other. "It's not likely, mind, but the worst comes to worst, and he is dead." "It's no fault of mine if it is," interposed the other man, with a look of terror, and clasping the Jew's arms with trembling fingers. "Mind it, Fagin. I had no hand in it. Anything but his death. I told you that from the first. I won't shed blood. It's always found out, and it haunts a man besides. If they shot him dead, I was not the cause, do you hear me? Fire this infernal den. What's that?" "What?" cried the Jew, grasping the cowl round his body with both arms as he sprung to his feet. "Where?" "Yonder," replied the man, glaring at the opposite wall. "The shadow! I saw the shadow of a woman, in a cloak and bonnet, pass along the wainscot like a breath." The Jew released his hold, and they rushed tumultuously from the room. The candle, wasted by the draught, was standing there where it had been placed. It showed them only the empty staircase, and their own white faces. They listened intently. A profound silence reigned throughout the house. "It's your fancy," said the Jew, taking up the light and turning to his companion. "I swear I saw it," replied Monks, trembling. "It was bending forward when I saw it first, and when I spoke it darted away." The Jew glanced contemptuously at the pale face of his associate, and, telling him he could follow, if he pleased, ascended the stairs. They looked into all the rooms. They were cold, bare, and empty. They descended into the passage, and thence into the cellars below. The green damp hung on the low walls. The tracks of the snail and the slug glistened in the light of the candle, but all was still as death. "What do you think now?" said the Jew, when they regained the passage. "Besides ourselves, there's not a creature in the house except Toby the boys, and they're safe enough, see here." As proof of the fact, the Jew drew forth 2 keys from his pocket, and explained that when he first went downstairs he had locked them in to prevent any intrusion on the conference. This accumulated testimony effectually staggered Mr. Monks. His protestations had gradually become less and less vehement as they proceeded in their search without making any discovery, and now he gave vent to several very grim laughs, and confessed that it would only have been his excited imagination. He had declined any renewal of the conversation, however, for that night, suddenly remembering that it was past 1 o'clock. And so the amiable couple parted. End of Chapter 26 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens.
Chapter 27 Atones for the unpoliteness of a former chapter, which deserted a lady most unceremoniously. As it would be by no means seemly in a humble author to keep so mighty a personage as a beadle waiting, with his back to the fire, and the skirt of his coat gathered up under his arms, until such time as it might suit his pleasure to relieve him. And as it would still less become his station or his gallantry to involve in the same neglect a lady on whom that beadle had looked with an eye of tenderness and affection, and in whose ear he had whispered sweet words, which, coming from such a quarter, might well thrill the bosom of maid or matron of whatsoever degree. The historian whose pen traces these words trusting that he knows his place, and that he entertains a becoming reverence for those upon earth to whom high and important authority is delegated, hastens to pay them that respect which their position demands, and to treat them with all that duteous ceremony which their exalted rank, and by consequence great virtues, imperatively claim at his hands. Towards this end, indeed, he had purposed to introduce in this place a dissertation touching the divine right of beetles, and elucidative of the position that a beetle can do no wrong, which could not fail to have been both pleasurable and profitable to the right-minded reader, but which he is unfortunately compelled, by want of time and space, to postpone to some more convenient and fitting opportunity. On the arrival of which he will be prepared to show that a beetle, properly constituted, that is to say, a parochial beetle attached to a parochial workhouse, and attending in his official capacity the parochial church, is, in right and virtue of his office, possessed of all the excellences and best qualities of humanity, and that to none of those excellences can mere company's beetles, or court of law beetles, or even chapel of ease beetles, save the last, and they in a very lowly and inferior degree, lay the remotest sustainable claim. Mr. Bumble had recounted the teaspoons, reweighed the sugar-tongs, and made a closer inspection of the milk-pot, and ascertained to a nicety the exact condition of the furniture, down to the very horsehair seats of the chairs, and had repeated each process full half a dozen times, before he began to think that it was time for Mrs. Corney to return. Thinking begets thinking. As there were no sounds of Mrs. Corney's approach, it occurred to Mr. Bumble that it would be an innocent and virtuous way of spending the time, if he were further to allay his curiosity by a cursory glance at the interior of Mrs. Corney's chest of drawers. Having listened at the keyhole to assure himself that nobody was approaching the chamber, Mr. Bumble, beginning at the bottom, proceeded to make himself acquainted with the contents of the 3 long drawers, which, being filled with various garments of good fashion and texture, carefully preserved between 2 layers of old newspapers, speckled with dry lavender, seemed to yield him exceeding satisfaction. Arriving in course of time at the right-hand corner drawer, in which was the key, and beholding therein a small padlocked box, which, being shaken, gave forth a pleasant sound as of the chinking of coin, Mr. Bumble returned with a stately walk to the fireplace, and, resuming his old attitude, said, with a grave and determined air, "I'll do it." He followed up this remarkable declaration by shaking his head in a waggish manner for 10 minutes, as though he were remonstrating with himself for being such a pleasant dog, and then he took a view of his legs and profile, with much seeming pleasure and interest. He was still placidly engaged in this latter survey when Mrs. Corney, hurrying into the room, threw herself, in a breathless state, on a chair by the fireside, and, covering her eyes with one hand, placed the other over her heart, and gasped for breath. "Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron. "What is this, ma'am? Has anything happened, ma'am? Pray answer me. I'm on... Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, "broken bottles." "Oh, Mr. Bumble," cried the lady, "I have been so dreadfully put out." "Put out, madam!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "Who has dared to—" "I know," said Mr. Bumble, checking himself with native majesty. "This is them wicious paupers." "It is dreadful to think of," said the lady, shuddering. "Then don't think of it, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," whimpered the lady. "Then take something, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble soothingly. "A little of the wine?" "Not for the world," replied Mrs. Corney. "I couldn't. Oh, the top shelf in the right-hand corner. Oh!" Uttering these words, the good lady pointed distractedly to the cupboard and underwent a convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet, and, snatching a pint-green glass bottle from the shelf thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents, and held it to the lady's lips. "I'm better now," said Mrs. Corney, falling back after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and, bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose. "Peppermint!" exclaimed Mrs. Corney in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beetle as she spoke. "Try it. There's a little something else in it." Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty. "It's very comforting," said Mrs. Corney. "Very much so indeed, ma'am," said the beetle. As he spoke, he drew a chair beside the matron, and tenderly inquired what had happened to distress her. "Nothing," replied Mrs. Corney. "I am a foolish, excitable, weak creature." "Not weak, ma'am," retorted Mr. Bumble, drawing his chair a little closer. "Are you a weak creature, Mrs. Corney?" "We are all weak creatures," said Mrs. Corney, laying down a general principle. "So we are," said the beetle. Nothing was said on either side for a minute or two afterwards. By the expiration of that time, Mr. Bumble had illustrated the position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which it gradually became entwined. "We are all weak creatures," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. "Don't sigh, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," said Mrs. Corney, and she sighed again. "This is a very comfortable room, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, looking round. "Another room, and this, ma'am, would be a complete thing." "It would be too much for one," murmured the lady. "But not for two, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble in soft accents. "Eh, Mrs. Corney?" Mrs. Corney dropped her head when the beetle said this. The beetle drooped his to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney, with great propriety, turned her head away and released her hand to get at her pocket-handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble. "The board allows you coals, don't they, Mrs. Corney?" inquired the beetle, affectionately pressing her hand. "And candles," replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. "Coals, candles, and house rent-free," said Mr. Bumble. "Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are!" The lady was not proof against this burst of feeling. She sank into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman, in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. "Such parochial perfection!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble, rapturously. "You know that Mr. Slout is worse to-night, my fascinator?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Corney, bashfully. "He can't live a week, the doctor says," pursued Mr. Bumble. "He is the master of this establishment. His death will cause a vacancy. That vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens! What an opportunity for a joining of hearts and housekeepings!" Mrs. Corney sobbed. "The little word?" said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty. "The one little word, my blessed Corney?" Yes," sighed out the matron. "One more," pursued the beetle. "Compose your darling feelings for only one more. When is it to come off?" Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak, and twice failed. At length, summoning up her courage, she threw her arms around Mr. Bumble's neck, and said it might be as soon as ever he pleased, and that he was an irresistible duck. Matters being thus amicably and satisfactorily arranged, the contract was solemnly ratified in another teacupful of the peppermint mixture, which was rendered the more necessary by the flutter and agitation of the lady's spirits. While it was being disposed of, she acquainted Mr. Bumble with the old woman's disease. "Very good," said that gentleman, sipping his peppermint. "I'll call at Sourberry's as I go home, and tell him to send to-morrow morning. Was it that as frightened you, love?" "It wasn't anything particular, dear," said the lady evasively. "It must have been something, love," urged Mr. Bumble. "Won't you tell your own bee?" "Not now," rejoined the lady. "One of these days, after we're married, dear." "After we're married!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "It wasn't any impudence from any of them male paupers as—" "No, love," interposed the lady hastily. "If I thought it was," continued Mr. Bumble, "if I thought as any one of 'em had dared to lift his vulgar eyes to that lovely countenance—" "They wouldn't have dared to do it, love," responded the lady. "They had better not," said Mr. Bumble, clenching his fist. "Let me see any man, parochial or extra-parochial, as would presume to do it, and I can tell him that he wouldn't do it a second time." Unembellished by any violence of gesticulation, this might have seemed no very high compliment to the lady's charms; but, as Mr. Bumble accompanied the threat with many warlike gestures, she was much touched with this proof of his devotion, and protested with great admiration that he was indeed a dove. The dove then turned up his coat-collar, and put on his cocked hat, and having exchanged a long and affectionate embrace with his future partner, once again braved the cold wind of the night, merely pausing for a few minutes in the male paupers' ward to abuse them a little, with the view of satisfying himself that he could fill the office of workhouse master with needful acerbity. Assured of his qualifications, Mr. Bumble left the building with a light heart and bright visions of his future promotion, which served to occupy his mind until he reached the shop of the undertaker. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry having gone out to tea and supper, and Noah Claypole not being at any time disposed to take upon himself a greater amount of physical exertion than is necessary to a convenient performance of the two functions of eating and drinking, the shop was not closed, although it was past the usual hour of shutting up. Mr. Bumble tapped with his cane on the counter several times, but, attracting no attention, and beholding a light shining through the glass window of the little parlour at the back of the shop, he made bold to peep in and see what was going forward. And when he saw what was going forward, he was not a little surprised. The cloth was laid for supper, the table was covered with bread and butter, plates and glasses, a porter-pot and a wine-bottle. At the upper end of the table, Mr. Noah Claypole lolled negligently in an easy-chair, with his legs thrown over one of the arms, an open clasp-knife in one hand and a mass of buttered bread in the other. Close beside him stood Charlotte, opening oysters from a barrel, which Mr. Claypole condescended to swallow with remarkable avidity. A more than ordinary redness in the region of the young gentleman's nose, and a kind of fixed wink in his right eye, denoted that he was in a slight degree intoxicated. These symptoms were confirmed by the intense relish with which he took his oysters, for which nothing but a strong appreciation of their cooling properties, in cases of internal fever, could have sufficiently accounted. "Here's a delicious fat one, Noah dear," said Charlotte. "Try him, do, only this one." "What a delicious thing is a oyster," remarked Mr. Claypole, after he had swallowed it. "What a pity it is a number of 'em should ever make you feel uncomfortable. Isn't it, Charlotte?" "It's quite a cruelty," said Charlotte. "So it is," acquiesced Mr. Claypole. "Aren't you fond of oysters?" "Not overmuch," replied Charlotte. "I like to see you eat 'em, Noah dear, better than eating 'em myself." "Lor!" said Noah reflectively. "How queer!" "Have another," said Charlotte. "Here's one with such a beautiful, delicate beard." "I can't manage any more," said Noah. "I'm very sorry. Come here, Charlotte, and I'll kiss yer." "What?" said Mr. Bumble, bursting into the room. "Say that again, sir." Charlotte uttered a scream and hid her face in her apron. Mr. Claypole, without making any further change in his position than suffering his legs to reach the ground, gazed at the beadle in drunken terror. "Say it again, you wild, audacious fellow," said Mr. Bumble. "How dare you mention such a thing, sir? How dare you encourage him, you insolent minx?" "Kiss her!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble in strong indignation. "Faugh!" "I didn't mean to do it," said Noah, blubbering. "She's always a kissin' of me, whether I like it or not." "Oh, Noah!" cried Charlotte reproachfully. "Ye are, ye know ye are," retorted Noah. "She's always a doing of it, Mr. Bumble, sir. She chucks me under the chin, please, sir, and makes all manner of love." "Silence!" cried Mr. Bumble sternly. "Take yourself downstairs, ma'am. Noah, you shut up the shop. Say another word till your master comes home, at your peril, and when he does come home, tell him that Mr. Bumble said he was to send a old woman's shell after breakfast tomorrow morning. Do you hear, sir?" "Kissing!" cried Mr. Bumble, holding up his hands. The sin and wickedness of the lower orders in this parochial district is frightful. If Parliament don't take their abominable courses under consideration, this country's ruined, and the character of the peasantry gone for ever." With these words the beadle strode, with a lofty and gloomy air, from the undertaker's premises. And now that we have accompanied him so far on his road home, and have made all necessary preparations for the old woman's funeral, let us set on foot a few inquiries after young Oliver Twist, and ascertain whether he be still lying in the ditch where Toby Crackit left him. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28. Looks after Oliver, and proceeds with his adventures. "Wolves tear your throats," muttered Sikes, grinding his teeth. "I wish I was amongst some of you. You'd howl the horser for it." As Sikes growled forth this imprecation with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of, he rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee, and turned his head for an instant to look back at his pursuers. There was little to be made out in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of men vibrated through the air, and the barking of the neighbouring dogs, roused by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction. "Stop, you white-livered hound!" cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who, making the best use of his long legs, was already ahead. "Stop!" The repetition of the word brought Toby to a dead standstill, for he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol-shot, and Sikes was in no mood to be played with. "Bear a hand with the boy!" cried Sikes, beckoning furiously to his confederate. "Come back!" Toby made a show of returning, but ventured in a low voice, broken for want of breath, to intimate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along. "Quicker!" cried Sikes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet, and drawing a pistol from his pocket. "Don't play booty with me!" At this moment the noise grew louder. Sikes, again looking round, could discern that the men who had given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of them. "It's all up, Bill!" cried Toby. "Drop the kid and show him your heels." With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit, preferring the chance of being shot by his friend to the certainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look around, threw over the prostrate form of Oliver the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge, as if to distract the attention of those behind from the spot where the boy lay, paused for a second before another hedge, which met it at right angles, and, whirling his pistol high into the air, cleared it at a bound, and was gone. "Ho! Ho there!" cried a tremulous voice in the rear. "Pincher! Neptune! Come here! Come here!" The dogs, who, in common with their masters, seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to the command. Three men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together.
"My advice, or leastway, I should say, my orders is," said the fattest man of the party, "that we immediately go home again."
"I am agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles," said a shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face and very polite, as frightened men frequently are. "I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen," said the third, who had called the dogs back. "Mr. Giles ought to know." "Certainly," replied the shorter man, "and whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our position to contradict him. No, no, I know my situation. Thank my stars, I know my situation." To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke.
"You were afraid, Brittles," said Mr. Giles.
"I ain't," said Brittles.
"You are,"
said Giles. "You are a falsehood, Mr. Giles," said Brittles.
"You're a lie, Brittles,"
said Mr. Giles. Now these four retorts arose from Mr. Giles' taunt, and Mr. Giles' taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again imposed upon himself under cover of a compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close, most philosophically. "I'll tell you what it is, gentlemen," said he. "We're all afraid."
"Speak for yourself, sir,"
said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party. "So I do," replied the man. "It's natural and proper to be afraid under such circumstances. I am."
"So am I," said Brittles. "Only there's no call to tell a man he is so bounceably."
These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who had once owned that he was afraid, upon which they all three faced about and ran back again with the completest unanimity, until Mr. Giles, who had the shortest wind of the party, as was encumbered with a pitchfork, most handsomely insisted on stopping to make an apology for his hastiness of speech.
"But it's wonderful," said Mr. Giles, when he had explained, "what a man will do when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, I know I should, if we'd have caught one of them rascals."
As the other two were impressed with a similar presentiment, and as their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of this sudden change in their temperament.
"I know what it was," said Mr. Giles. "It was the gate."
"I shouldn't wonder if it was," exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea.
"You may depend upon it," said Giles, "that gate stopped the flow of the excitement. I felt all mine suddenly going away as I was climbing over it."
By a remarkable coincidence, the other two had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment. It was quite obvious, therefore, that it was the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all three remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the two men who had surprised the burglars, and a traveling tinker who had been sleeping in an outhouse, and who had been roused, together with his two mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion. Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but keeping very close together notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round whenever a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the three men hurried back to a tree, behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves in what direction to fire. Catching up the light, they made the best of their way home at a good round trot, and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, the light might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder as day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, the pathways in low places were all mire and water, the damp breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by, with a hollow moaning. Still Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing, as its first dull hue, the death of night, rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness grew more and more defined, and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. The rain came down, thick and fast, and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes. But Oliver felt it not, as it beat against him, for still he lay stretched, helpless and unconscious, on his bed of clay. At length a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it, the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side. The bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture, and when he had done so, he looked feebly round for help and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but, shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart, which seemed to warn him that if he lay there he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man, but he kept up, nevertheless, and with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward, he knew not whither. And now hosts of bewildering and confusing ideas came crowding on his mind. He seemed to be still walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said sounded in his ears, and when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling, he found that he was talking to them. Then he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as on the previous day, and as shadowy people passed them, he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly he started back at the report of firearms. There rose into the air loud cries and shouts, lights gleamed before his eyes, all was noise and tumult, as some unseen hand bore him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions there ran an undefined, uneasy consciousness of pain, which wearied and tormented him incessantly. Thus he staggered on, creeping almost mechanically between the bars of the gate or through the hedge gaps as they came in his way, until he reached a road, Here the rain began to fall so heavily that it roused him. He looked about, and saw that at no great distance there was a house, which perhaps he could reach. Pitying his condition, they might have compassion on him, and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings than on the lonely open fields. He summoned all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. As he drew nearer to this house, a feeling came over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall! On the grass inside he had fallen on his knees last night and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place that for an instant he forgot the agony of his wound and thought only of flight. Flight! He could scarcely stand, and if he were in full possession of all the best powers of his slight and youthful frame, whither could he fly? He pushed against the garden gate. It was unlocked, and swung open on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, climbed the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and, his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened that, about this time, Mr. Giles, Brittles, and the tinker were recruiting themselves, after the fatigues and terrors of the night, with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Not that it was Mr. Giles's habit to admit to too great familiarity the humble servants, towards whom it was rather his wont to deport himself with a lofty affability, which, while it gratified, could not fail to remind them of his superior position in society. But death, fires, and burglary make all men equals, so Mr. Giles sat with his legs stretched out before the kitchen fender, leaning his left arm on the table, while with his right he illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his bearers, but especially the cook and housemaid, who were of the party, listened with breathless interest. "It was about 2:30, said Mr. Giles, or I wouldn't swear that it mightn't have been a little nearer 3 when I woke up, and turning round in my bed, as it might be so." Here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over him to imitate bedclothes. "I fancied I heard a noise." At this point of the narrative the cook turned pale, and asked the housemaid to shut the door, who asked Brittles, who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear. "Heard a noise," continued Mr. Giles. "I says at first, this is illusion, and was composing myself after sleep, when I heard the noise again, distinct." "What sort of a noise?" asked the cook. "A kind of busting noise," replied Mr. Giles, looking round him. "More like the noise of powdering an iron bar on a nutmeg grater," suggested Brittles. "It was when you heard it, sir," rejoined Mr. Giles, "but at this time it had a busting sound. I turned on the clothes," continued Giles, rolling back the tablecloth, "sat up in bed, and listened." The cook and housemaid simultaneously ejaculated, "Law!" and drew their chairs closer together. "I heard it now, quite apparent," resumed Mr. Giles. "Somebody, I says, is forcing of a door or window. What's to be done? I'll call up that poor lad Brittles, and save him from being murdered in his bed, or his throat, I says, might be cut from his right ear to his left without his ever knowing it." Here all eyes were turned upon Brittles, who fixed his upon the speaker, and stared at him with his mouth wide open and his face expressive of the most unmitigated horror. "I tossed off the clothes," said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth, and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid, "got softly out of bed, drew on a pair of—" "Ladies present, Mr. Giles," murmured the tinker. "Of shoes, sir," said Giles, turning upon him, and laying great emphasis on the word. "Seized the loaded pistol that always goes upstairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room. 'Brittles,' I says, when I had woke him, 'don't be frightened.' 'So you did,' observed Brittles in a low voice. 'We're dead men, I think, Brittles,' I says," continued Giles, "but don't be frightened." "Was he frightened?" asked the cook. "Not a bit of it," replied Mr. Giles. "He was as firm, pretty near as firm as I was." "I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me," observed the housemaid. "You're a woman," retorted Brittles, plucking up a little.
Brittles is right, said Mr. Giles, nodding his head approvingly. From a woman, nothing else was to be expected. We, being men, took a dark lantern that was standing on Brittle's hob, and groped our way downwards in the pitch dark, as it might be so. Mr. Giles had risen from his seat, and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently, in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair. The cook and housemaid screamed. "It was a knock," said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. "Open the door, somebody." Nobody moved. "It seems a strange sort of thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning," said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blank himself. "But the door must be opened. Do you hear somebody?" Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles, but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he tendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. Both women were out of the question. "If Brittles would rather open the door in the presence of witnesses," said Mr. Giles after a short silence, "I am ready to make one." "So am I," said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party being somewhat reassured by the discovery, made on throwing open the shutters, that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs, with the dogs in front. The 2 women, who were afraid to stay below, brought up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud, to warn any evil-disposed person outside that they were strong in numbers, and by a master stroke of policy, originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm, to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed. The group, peering timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion. "A boy!" exclaimed Mr. Giles valiantly, pushing the tinker into the background. "What's the matter with the, eh? Why, Brittles, look here, don't you know?" Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the broken limb, lugged him straight into the hall and deposited him at full length on the floor thereof. "Here he is!" bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement up the staircase. "Here's one of the thieves, ma'am! Here's a thief, miss! Wounded, miss! I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light. In a lantern, miss!" cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth so that his voice might travel the better. The 2 women servants ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself in endeavoring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hanged. In the midst of all this noise and commotion there was heard a sweet female voice, which quelled it in an instant. "Giles," whispered the voice from the stairhead. "I'm here, miss," replied Mr. Giles. "Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him." "Hush," replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt as much as the thieves did. Is the poor creature much hurt?" "Wounded desperate, miss," replied Giles, with indescribable complacency. "He looks as if he were a-going, miss," bawled Brittles in the same manner as before. "Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should?" "Hush, pray, there's a good man," rejoined the lady. "Wait quietly only one instant while I speak to aunt." With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away. She soon returned with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles's room, that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch with all speed a constable and a doctor. "But won't you take one look at him first, miss?" asked Mr. Giles, with as much pride as if Oliver were some bird of rare plumage that he had skilfully brought down. "Not one little peep, miss?" "Not for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake." The old servant looked up at the speaker, as she turned away, with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped carry him upstairs,
with the care and solicitude of a woman. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 has an introductory account of the inmates of the house to which Oliver resorted. In a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance, there sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast-table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in a full suit of black, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some half-way between the sideboard and the breakfast-table, and, with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back and inclined the merest trifle on one side, his left leg advanced and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left hand hung down by his side, grasping a waiter, looked like one who laboured under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision, in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat in a stately manner with her hands folded on the table before her. Her eyes, and age had dimmed but little of their brightness, were attentively upon her young companion. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, at that age when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be, without impiety, supposed to abide in such as hers. She was not past 17, cast in so slight and exquisite a mould, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eye, and was stamped upon her noble head, seemed scarcely of her age, or of the world, and yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humour, the thousand lights that played about the face and left no shadow there, above all, the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were made for home, and fireside peace and happiness. She was busily engaged in the little offices of the table. Chancing to raise her eyes as the elder lady was regarding her, she playfully put back her hair, which was simply braided on her forehead, and threw into her beaming looks such an expression of affection and artless loveliness that blessed spirits might have smiled to look upon her. "And Brittles has been gone upwards of an hour, has he?" asked the old lady after a pause. "An hour and 12 minutes, ma'am," replied Mr. Giles, referring to a silver watch which he drew forth by a black ribbon. "He is always slow," remarked the old lady. "Brittles always was a slow boy, ma'am," replied the attendant, and seeing, by the by, that Brittles had been a slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one. "He gets worse instead of better, I think," said the elder lady. "It is very inexcusable in him if he stops to play with any other boys," said the young lady, smiling. Mr. Giles was apparently considering the propriety of indulging in a respectful smile himself, when a gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman, who ran straight up to the door, and who, getting quickly into the house by some mysterious process, burst into the room and nearly overturned Mr. Giles and the breakfast table together. "I never heard of such a thing!" exclaimed the fat gentleman. "My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of the night, too! I never heard of such a thing!" With these expressions of condolence, the fat gentleman shook hands with both ladies, and, drawing up a chair, inquired how they found themselves. "You ought to be dead, positively dead with the fright," said the fat gentleman. "Why didn't you send? Bless me, my man should have come in a minute, and so would I, and my assistant would have been delighted, or anybody, I'm sure, under such circumstances. Dear, dear, so unexpected! In the silence of the night, too!" The doctor seemed especially troubled by the fact of the robbery having been unexpected, and attempted in the night-time, as if it were the established custom of gentlemen in the housebreaking way to transact business at noon, and to make an appointment by post a day or two previous. "And you, Miss Rose," said the doctor, turning to the young lady, "Oh, very much so indeed," said Rose, interrupting him. "But there is a poor creature upstairs whom aunt wishes you to see." "Ah, to be sure," replied the doctor. "So there is. That was your handiwork, Giles, I understand." Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting the teacups to rights, blushed very red and said that he had had that honour. "Honour, eh?" said the doctor. "Well, I don't know. Perhaps it's as honourable to hit a thief in a back kitchen as to hit your man at 12 paces. Fancy that he fired in the air and you fought a duel, Giles." Mr. Giles, who thought this light treatment of the matter an unjust attempt at diminishing his glory, answered respectfully that it was not for the like of him to judge about that, but he rather thought it was no joke to the opposite party. "Gad, that's true," said the doctor. "Where is he? Show me the way. I'll look in again as I come down, Mrs. Maylie. That's the little window that he got in at, eh? Well, I couldn't have believed it." Talking all the way, he followed Mr. Giles upstairs, and while he is going upstairs, the reader may be informed that Mr. Losberne, a surgeon in the neighbourhood, known through a circuit of 10 miles round as the Doctor, had grown fat, more from good humour than from good living, and was as kind and hearty, and withal as eccentric an old bachelor as will be found in 5 times that space by any explorer alive. The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. A large flat box was fetched out of the gig, and a bedroom bell was rung very often, and the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually, from which tokens it was justly concluded that something important was going on above. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysterious, and closed the door carefully. "This is a very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door, as if to keep it shut. "He is not in danger, I hope?" said the old lady. "Why, that would not be an extraordinary thing under the circumstances," replied the doctor, "though I don't think he is. Have you seen the thief?" "No," rejoined the old lady. "Nor heard anything about him?" "No." "I beg your pardon, ma'am," interposed Mr. Giles, "but I was going to tell you about him when Dr. Losberne came in." The fact was that Mr. Giles had not at first been able to bring his mind to the avowal that he had only shot a boy. Such commendations had been bestowed upon his bravery that he could not, for the life of him, help postponing the explanation for a few delicious minutes, during which he had flourished in the very zenith of a brief reputation for undaunted courage. "Rose wished to see the man," said Mrs. Maylie, "but I wouldn't hear of it." "Humph," rejoined the doctor. "There is nothing very alarming in his appearance. Have you any objection to see him in my presence?" "If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not." "Then I think it is necessary," said the doctor. "At all events, I am quite sure that you would deeply regret not having done so, if you postpone it. He is perfectly quiet and comfortable now. Allow me, Miss Rose, will you permit me? Not the slightest fear. I pledge you my honour." End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 relates to what Oliver's new visitors thought of him. With many loquacious assurances that they would be agreeably surprised in the aspect of the criminal, the doctor drew the young lady's arms through one of his, and offering his disengaged hand to Mrs. Maylie, led them with much ceremony and stateliness upstairs. "Now," said the doctor in a whisper, as he softly turned the handle of the bedroom door, "let us hear what you think of him. He has not been shaved very recently, but he don't look at all ferocious notwithstanding. Stop, though. Let me first see that he is in visiting order." Stepping before them, he looked into the room. Motioning them to advance, he closed the door when they had entered, and gently drew back the curtains of the bed. Upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. His wounded arm, bound and splintered up, was crossed upon his breast. His head reclined upon the other arm, which was half hidden by his long hair, as it streamed over the pillow. The honest gentleman held the curtain in his hand, and looked on for a minute or so in silence. Whilst he was watching the patient thus, the younger lady glided softly past, and seating herself in a chair by the bedside, gathered Oliver's hair from his face. As she stooped over him, her tears fell upon his forehead. The boy stirred and smiled in his sleep, as though these marks of pity and compassion had awakened some pleasant dream of a love and affection he had never known. Thus a strain of gentle music, or the rippling of water in a silent place, or the odour of a flower, or the mention of a familiar word, will sometimes call up sudden dim remembrances of scenes that never were in this life, which vanish like a breath, which some brief memory of a happier existence long gone by would seem to have awakened, which no voluntary exertion of the mind can ever recall. "What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers." "Vice," said the surgeon, replacing the curtains, "takes up her abode in many temples, and who can say that a fair outside shall not enshrine her?" "But at so early an age," urged Rose. "My dear young lady," rejoined the surgeon, mournfully shaking his head, "crime, like death, is not confined to the old and withered alone. The youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims." "But can you, oh, can you really believe that this delicate boy has been the voluntary associate of the worst outcasts of society?" said Rose. The surgeon shook his head, in a manner which intimated that he feared it was very possible, and observing that they might disturb the patient, led the way into an adjoining apartment. "But even if he has been wicked," pursued Rose, "think how young he is. Think that he may never have known a mother's love, or the comfort of a home. That ill usage and blows, or the want of bread, may have driven him to herd with men who have forced him to guilt. Aunt, dear aunt, for mercy's sake think of this before you let them drag this sick child to a prison, which in any case must be the grave of all his chances of amendment. Oh, as you love me, and know that I have never felt the want of parents in your goodness and affection, but that I might have done so, and might have been equally helpless and unprotected with this poor child, have pity upon him before it is too late." "My dear love," said the elder lady, as she folded the weeping girl into her bosom, "do you think I would harm a hair of his head?" "Oh, no," replied Rose eagerly. "No, surely," said the old lady. "My days are drawing to a close, and may mercy be shown to me as I show it to others. What can I do to save him, sir?" "Let me think, ma'am," said the doctor. "Let me think." Mr. Losberne thrust his hands into his pockets, and took several turns up and down the room, often stopping and balancing himself on his toes, and frowning frightfully. After various exclamations of "I've got it now," and "No, I haven't," and as many renewals of the walking and frowning, he at length made a dead halt, and spoke as follows: "I think if you give me a full and unlimited commission to bully Giles and that little boy Brittles, I can manage it. Giles is a faithful fellow, and an old servant, I know, but you can make it up to him in 1,000 ways, and reward him for being such a good shot besides. You don't object to that?" "Unless there is some other way of preserving the child," replied Mrs. Maylie. "There is no other," said the doctor. "No other, take my word for it." "Then my aunt invests you with full powers," said Rose, smiling through her tears. "But pray don't be harder upon the poor fellow than is indispensably necessary." "You seem to think," retorted the doctor, "that everybody is disposed to be hard-hearted to-day, except yourself, Miss Rose. I only hope, for the sake of the rising male sex generally, that you may be found in as vulnerable and soft-hearted a mood by the first eligible young fellow who appeals to your compassion. And I wish I were a young fellow, that I might avail myself on the spot of such a favourable opportunity for doing so as the present." "You are as great a boy as poor Brittles himself," returned Rose, blushing. "Well," said the doctor, laughing heartily, "that is no very difficult matter. But to return to this boy, the great point of our agreement is yet to come. He will wake in an hour or so, I dare say, and although I have told that thick-headed constable fellow downstairs that he mustn't be moved or spoken to on peril of his life, I think we may converse with him without danger. Now, I make this stipulation, that I shall examine him in your presence, and that, if from what he says we judge, and I can show to the satisfaction of your cool reason, that he is a real and thorough bad one, which is more than possible, he shall be left to his fate without any further interference on my part, at all events." "Oh, no, aunt," entreated Rose. "Oh, yes, aunt," said the doctor. "Is it a bargain?" "He cannot be hardened in vice," said Rose. "It is impossible." "Very good," retorted the doctor. "Then so much the more reason for acceding to my proposition." Finally the treaty was entered into, and the parties thereunto sat down to wait, with some impatience, until Oliver should awake. The patience of the two ladies was destined to undergo a longer trial than Mr. Losberne had led them to expect, for hour after hour passed on, and still Oliver slumbered heavily. It was evening, indeed, before the kind-hearted doctor brought them the intelligence that he was at length sufficiently restored to be spoken to. The boy was very ill, he said, and weak from the loss of blood, but his mind was so troubled with anxiety to disclose something that he deemed it better to give him the opportunity than to insist upon his remaining quiet until next morning, which he should otherwise have done. The conference was a long one. Oliver told them all his simple history, and was often compelled to stop by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing to hear, in the darkened room, the feeble voice of the sick child recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh, if when we oppress and grind our fellow creatures, we bestowed but one thought on the dark evidence of human error, which, like dense and heavy clouds, are rising, slowly it is true, but not less surely, to heaven, to pour their after-vengeance on our heads. If we heard but one instant, in imagination, the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle, and no pride shut out, where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong that each day's life brings with it? Oliver's pillow was smoothed by gentle hands that night, and loveliness and virtue watched him as he slept. He felt calm and happy, and could have died without a murmur. The momentous interview was no sooner concluded, and Oliver composed to rest again, than the doctor, after wiping his eyes, and condemning them for being weak all at once, betook himself downstairs to open upon Mr. Giles, and finding nobody about the parlours, it occurred to him that he could perhaps originate the proceedings with better effect in the kitchen. So into the kitchen he went. There were assembled in that lower house of the domestic parliament the women servants, Mr. Brittles, Mr. Giles, the tinker, who had received a special invitation to regale himself for the remainder of the day in consideration of his services, and the constable. The latter gentleman had a large staff, a large head, large features, and large half boots, and he looked as if he had been taking a proportionate allowance of ale, as indeed he had. The adventures of the previous night were still under discussion, for Mr. Giles was expatiating upon his presence of mind when the doctor entered. Mr. Brittles, with a mug of ale in his hand, was corroborating everything before his superior said it. "Sit still," said the doctor, waving his hand. "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Giles. "Missus wished some ale to be given out, sir, and as I felt no ways inclined for my own little room, sir, and was disposed for company, I am taking mine among 'em here." Brittles headed a low murmur, by which the ladies and gentlemen generally were understood to express the gratification they derived from Mr. Giles's condescension. Mr. Giles looked round with a patronizing air, as much as to say that so long as they behaved properly, he would not desert them. "How is the patient to-night, sir?" asked Giles. "So-so," returned the doctor. "I am afraid you have got yourself into a scrape there, Mr. Giles." "I hope you don't mean to say, sir," said Mr. Giles, trembling, "that he's going to die? If I thought it, I should never be happy again. I wouldn't cut a boy off. No, not even Brittles here. Not for all the plate in the county, sir. That's not the point, said the doctor mysteriously. Mr. Giles, are you a Protestant? Yes, sir, I hope so, faltered Mr. Giles, who had turned very pale. And what are you, boy? Said the doctor, turning sharply upon Brittles. Lord bless ye, sir, replied Brittles, starting violently. I'm the same as Mr. Giles, sir. Then tell me this, said the doctor, both of you. Are you going to take upon yourselves to swear that that boy upstairs is the boy that was put through the little window last night? Out with it. Come, we are prepared for you. The doctor, who was universally considered one of the best-tempered creatures on earth, made this demand in such a dreadful tone of anger that Giles and Brittles, who were considerably muddled by ale and excitement, stared at each other in a state of stupefaction. Pay attention to the reply, Constable, will you? Said the doctor, shaking his forefinger with great solemnity of manner, and tapping the bridge of his nose with it, to bespeak the exercise of that worthy's utmost acuteness. Something may come of this before long. The constable looked as wise as he could, and took up his staff of office, which had been reclining indolently in the chimney corner. It's a simple question of identity, you will observe, said the doctor. That's what it is, sir, replied the constable, coughing with great violence, for he had finished his ale in a hurry, and some of it had gone the wrong way. Here's the house broken into, said the doctor, and a couple of men catch one moment's glimpse of a boy in the midst of gunpowder smoke and in all the distraction of alarm and darkness. Here's a boy come to that very same house next morning, and because he happens to have his arm tied up, these men lay violent hands upon him, by doing which they place his life in great danger, and swear he is the thief. Now, the question is whether these men are justified by the fact. If not, in what situation do they place themselves? The constable nodded profoundly. He said if that wasn't law, he would be glad to know what was. I ask you again, thundered the doctor, are you, on your solemn oaths, able to identify that boy? Brittles looked doubtfully at Mr. Giles. Mr. Giles looked doubtfully at Brittles. The constable put his hand behind his ear to catch the reply. The two women and the tinker leaned forward to listen. The doctor glanced keenly around, when a ring was heard at the gate, and at the same moment the sound of wheels. "It's the runners!" cried Brittles, to all appearances much relieved. "The what?" exclaimed the doctor, aghast in his turn. "The Bow Street officers, sir," replied Brittles, taking up a candle. "Me and Mr. Giles sent for 'em this morning." "What?" cried the doctor. "Yes," replied Brittles. "I sent a message up by the coachman, and I only wonder why they weren't here before, sir." "You did you? Then confound your slow coaches down here. That's all," said the doctor, walking away. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 involves a critical position. "Who's that?" inquired Brittles, opening the door a little way, with the chain up and peeping out, shading the candle with his hand. "Open the door," replied a man outside. "It's the officers from Bow Street, as was sent to-day." Much comforted by this assurance, Brittles opened the door to its full width, and confronted a portly man in a great coat, who walked in without saying anything more, and wiped his shoes on the mat as coolly as if he lived there. "Just send somebody out to relieve my mate, will you, young man?" said the officer. "He's in the gig, a-minding the prad. Have you got a coach-house here, that you could put it up in, for 5 or 10 minutes? Brittles replying in the affirmative, and pointing out the building, the portly man stepped back to the garden gate, and helped his companion to put up the gig, while Brittles lighted them in a state of great admiration. This done, they returned to the house, and being shown into a parlour, took off their greatcoats and hats, and showed like what they were. The man who had knocked at the door was a stout personage of middle height, aged about 50, with shiny black hair cropped pretty close, half whiskers, a round face, and sharp eyes. The other was red-headed, bony man in top boots, with a rather ill-favoured countenance and a turned-up, sinister-looking nose. "Tell your governor that Blathers and Duff is here, will you?" said the stouter man, smoothing down his hair, and laying a pair of handcuffs on the table. "Oh, good evening, master. Can I have a word or two with you in private, if you please?" This was addressed to Mr. Losberne, who now made his appearance. That gentleman, motioning Brittles to retire, brought in the two ladies and shut the door. "This is the lady of the house," said Mr. Losberne, motioning towards Mrs. Maylie. Mr. Blathers made a bow. Being desired to sit down, he put his hat on the floor, and taking a chair, motioned to Duff to do the same. The latter gentleman, who did not appear quite so much accustomed to good society, or quite so much at ease in it, one of the two, seated himself after undergoing several muscular affectations of the limbs, and the head of his stick into his mouth with some embarrassment. "Now, with regard to this here robbery, master," said Blathers, "what are the circumstances?" Mr. Losberne, who appeared desirous of gaining time, recounted them at great length and with much circumlocution. Messrs. Blathers and Duff looked very knowing meanwhile, and occasionally exchanged a nod. "I can't say for certain till I see the work, of course," said Blathers, "but my opinion at once is, I don't mind committing myself to that extent, that this wasn't done by a yokel. Eh, Duff?" "Certainly not," replied Duff. "And translating the word yokel for the benefit of the ladies, I apprehend your meaning to be that this attempt was not made by a countryman," said Mr. Losberne with a smile. "That's it, master," replied Blathers. "This is all about the robbery, is it?" "All," replied the doctor. "Now what is this about this here boy that the servants are a-talking on?" said Blathers. "Nothing at all," replied the doctor. "One of the frightened servants chose to take it into his head that he was something to do with this attempt to break into the house. But it's nonsense, sheer absurdity." "Wery easy disposed of, if it is," remarked Duff. "What he says is quite correct," observed Blathers, nodding his head in a confirmatory way, and playing carelessly with the handcuffs, as if they were a pair of castanets. "Who is the boy? What account does he give of himself? Where did he come from? He didn't drop out of the clouds, did he, master?" "Of course not," replied the doctor, with a nervous glance at the two ladies. "I know his whole history, but we can talk about that presently. You would like first to see the place where the thieves made their attempt, I suppose?" "Certainly," rejoined Mr. Blathers. "We had better inspect the premises first, and examine the servants afterwards. That's the usual way of doing business." Lights were then procured, and Messrs. Blathers and Duff, attended by the native constable, Brittles, Giles, and everybody else in short, went into the little room at the end of the passage and looked out at the window, and afterwards went round by way of the lawn and looked in at the window, and after that had a candle handled out to inspect the shutter with, and after that a lantern to trace the footsteps with, and after that a pitchfork to poach the bushes with. This done, amidst the breathless interest of all beholders, they came in again, and Mr. Giles and Brittles were put through a melodramatic representation of their share in the previous night's adventure, which they performed some 6 times over, contradicting each other in not more than one important respect, the first time, and in not more than a dozen the last. This consummation being arrived at, Blathers and Duff cleared the room and held a long council together, compared with which, for secrecy and solemnity, a consultation of great doctors on the knottiest point of medicine would be mere child's play. Meanwhile the doctor walked up and down the next room in a very uneasy state, and Mrs. Maylie and Rose looked on with anxious faces. "Upon my word," he said, making a halt after a great number of very rapid turns, "I hardly know what to do." "Surely," said Rose, "the poor child's story, faithfully repeated to these men, will be sufficient to exonerate him." "I doubt it, my dear young lady," said the doctor, shaking his head. "I don't think it would exonerate him, either with them or with legal functionaries of a higher grade. What is he, after all, they would say? A runaway. Judged by mere worldly considerations and probabilities, his story is a very doubtful one." "You believe it, surely?" interrupted Rose. "I believe it, strange as it is, and perhaps I may be an old fool for doing so," rejoined the doctor. "But I don't think it is exactly the tale for a practical police officer, nevertheless." "Why not?" demanded Rose. "Because, my pretty cross-examiner," replied the doctor, "because, viewed with their eyes, there are many ugly points about it. He can only prove the parts that look ill, and none of those that look well. Confound the fellows, they will have the why and the wherefore, and will take nothing for granted. On his own showing, you see, he has been the companion of thieves for some time past. He has been carried to a police officer on a charge of picking a gentleman's pocket. He has been taken away forcibly from that gentleman's house to a place which he cannot describe or point out, and of the situation of which he has not the remotest idea. He is brought down to Chertsey by men who seem to have taken a violent fancy to him, whether he will or no, and is put through a window to rob a house, and then, just at the very moment when he is going to alarm the inmates, and so do the very thing that would set him all to rights, there rushes into the way a blundering dog of a half-bred butler, and shoots him, as if on purpose to prevent him doing any good for himself. Don't you see all this?" "I see it, of course," replied Rose, smiling at the doctor's impetuosity. "But still I do not see anything in it to criminate the poor child." "No," replied the doctor, "of course not. Bless the bright eyes of your sex. They never see, whether for good or bad, more than one side of any question, and that is always the one which first presents itself to them." Having given vent to this result of experience, the doctor put his hands into his pocket, and walked up and down the room with even greater rapidity than before. "The more I think of it," said the doctor, "the more I see that it will occasion endless trouble and difficulty if we put these men in possession of the boy's real story. I am certain it will not be believed, and even if they do nothing to him in the end, still the dragging it forward and giving publicity all the doubts that will be cast upon it must interfere materially with your benevolent plan of rescuing him from misery." "Oh, what is to be done?" cried Rose. "Dear, dear, why did they send for these people?" "Why, indeed!" exclaimed Mrs. Maylie. "I would not have had them here for the world." "All I know is," said Mr. Losberne at last, sitting down with a kind of desperate calmness, "that we must try and carry it off with a bold face. The object is a good one, and that must be our excuse. The boy has strong symptoms of fever upon him, and is in no condition to be talked to any more. That's one comfort. We must make the best of it, and if bad be the best, it is no fault of ours. Come in." "Well, master," said Blathers, entering the room followed by his colleague, and making the door fast before he said any more, "this wasn't a put-up thing." "And what the devil's a put-up thing?" demanded the doctor impatiently. "We shall call it put-up robbery, ladies," said Blathers, turning to them as if he pitied their ignorance, but had a contempt for the doctor's, "when the servants is in it." "Nobody suspected them in this case," said Mrs. Maylie. "Very likely not, ma'am," replied Blathers, "but they might have been in it for all that. More likely on that very account," said Duff. "We find it was a town hand," said Blathers, continuing his report, "for the style of work is first rate." "Very pretty indeed it is," remarked Duff in an undertone. "There was two of 'em in it," continued Blathers, "and they had a boy with 'em. That's plain from the size of the window. That's all to be said at present. We'll see this lad that you've got upstairs at once, if you please." "Perhaps they will take something to drink first, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, his face brightening as if some new thought had occurred to him. "Oh, to be sure!" exclaimed Rose eagerly. "You shall have it immediately, if you will." "Why, thank you, miss," said Blathers, drawing his coat sleeves across his mouth. "It's dry work, this sort of duty. Anything that's handy, miss. Don't put yourself out of the way on our accounts." "What shall it be?" asked the doctor, following the young lady to the sideboard. "A little drop of spirits, master, if it's all the same," replied Blathers. "It's a cold ride from London, ma'am, and I always finds that spirits comes home warmer to the feelings." This interesting communication was addressed to Mrs. Maylie, who received it very graciously. While it was being conveyed to her, the doctor slipped out of the room. "Ah," said Mr. Blathers, not holding his wine-glass by the stem, but grasping the bottom between his thumb and forefinger of his left hand, and placing it in front of his chest. "I have seen a good many places of business like this in my time, ladies." "That crack down the back of the lane at Edmonton, Blathers," said Mr. Dove, assisting his colleague's memory. "That was something in this way, wasn't it?" rejoined Mr. Blathers. "That was done by Conky Chickweed, that was." "You always gave that to him," replied Duff. "It was the family pet, I tell you. Conky hadn't any more to do with it than I had." "Get out," retorted Mr. Blathers. "I know better. Do you mind that time when Conky was robbed of his money, though? What a start that was! Better than any novel book I ever see." "What was that?" inquired Rose, anxious to encourage any symptoms of good humour in the unwelcome guests. "It was a robbery, miss, that hardly anybody would have been down upon," said Blathers. "This here Conky Chickweed—" "Conky means nosy, ma'am," interposed Duff. "Of course the lady knows that, doesn't she?" demanded Mr. Blathers. "Always interrupting you are, partner. This here Conky Chickweed, miss, kept a public house over Battlebridge way, and he had a cellar where a good many young lords went to see cockfighting and badger drawing and that. And a weary intellectual manner the sport was conducted in, for I've seen 'em often. He warn't one of the family at that time. The one night he was robbed of 327 guineas in a canvas bag. That was stole out of his bedroom in the dead of night by a tall man with a black patch over his eye, who had concealed himself under the bed, and after committing the robbery jumped slap out of the window, which was only a story high. He was very quick about it. But Conky was quick too, for he fired a blunderbuss after him and roused the neighbourhood. They set up a hue and cry directly, and when they came to look about 'em, found that Conky had hit the robber, for there were traces of blood all the way to some palings a good distance off, and there they lost 'em. However, he had made off with the blunt, and consequently the name of Mr. Chickweed, licensed whittler, appeared in the Gazette among the other bankrupts, and all manner of benefits and subscriptions, and I don't know what all, was got up for the poor man, who was in a very low state of mind about his loss, and went up and down the streets for 3 or 4 days, a-pulling his hair off in such a desperate manner that many people was afraid he might be going to make away with himself. One day he came up to the office, all in a hurry, and had a private interview with the magistrate, who, after a deal of talk, rings the bell and orders Jem Spires in. Jem was an active officer, and tells him to go and assist Mr. Chickweed in apprehending the man as robbed his house. "I see him, Spires," said Chickweed, "past my house yesterday morning." "Why didn't you up and collar him?" says Spires. "I was so struck all of a heap that you might have fractured my skull with a toothpick," says the poor man. "But we're sure to have him, for between 10 and 11 o'clock at night he passed again." Spires no longer heard this than he put some clean linen and a comb in his pocket, in case he should have to stop a day or two, and away he goes, and sets himself down at one of the public-house windows behind the little red curtain, with his hat on, all ready to bolt out at a moment's notice. He was smoking his pipe here late at night, when all of a sudden Chickweed roars out, Here he is! Stop thief! Murder! Jem Spires dashes out, and there he sees Chickweed a-tearing down the street full cry. Away goes Spires, on goes Chickweed, round turns the people, everyone roars out, "Thieves!" and Chickweed himself keeps on shouting all the time like mad. Spires loses sight of him a minute as he turns a corner, shoots round, sees a little crowd, dives in. "Which is the man?" "Me," says Chickweed. "I've lost him again." It was a remarkable occurrence, but he wasn't to be seen nowhere. So they went back to the public house. Next morning Spires took his old place and looked out from behind the curtain for a tall man with a black patch over his eye, till his own 2 eyes ached again. At last he couldn't help shutting 'em to ease 'em a minute, and the very moment he did so, he hears Chickweed a-roaring out, "Here he is!" Off he starts once more, with Chickweed halfway down the street ahead of him, and after twice as long a run as yesterday's one, the man's lost again. This was done once or twice more, till one half the neighbours gave out that Mr. Chickweed had been robbed by the devil, who was playing tricks with him afterwards, and the other half that poor Mr. Chickweed had gone mad with grief. "What did Jem Spires say?" inquired the doctor, who had returned to the room shortly after the commencement of the story. "Jem Spires," resumed the officer, "for a long time said nothing at all, and listened to everything without seeming to, which showed he understood his business. But one morning he walked into the bar, and taking out his snuff-book, says, 'Chickweed, I've found out who done this here robbery.' 'Have you?' said Chickweed. 'Oh, my dear Spires, only let me have vengeance, and I shall die contented. Oh, my dear Spires, where is the villain?' 'Come,' says Spires, offering him a pinch of snuff. 'None of that gammon. You did it yourself.' So he had, and a good bit of money he had made by it too, and nobody would ever have found it out if he hadn't been so precious anxious to keep up appearances," said Mr. Blathers, putting down his wine-glass and clinking the handcuffs together. "Very curious indeed," observed the doctor. "Now, if you please, you can walk upstairs." "If you please, sir," returned Mr. Blathers. Closely following Mr. Losberne, the 2 officers ascended to Oliver's bedroom, Mr. Giles preceding the party with a lighted candle. Oliver had been dozing, but looked worse, and was more feverish than he had appeared yet. Being assisted by the doctor, he managed to sit up in bed for a minute or so, and looked at the strangers without at all understanding what was going forward, in fact, without seeming to recollect where he was or what had been passing. "This," said Mr. Losberne, speaking softly, but with great vehemence notwithstanding, "is the lad who, being accidentally wounded by a spring gun in some boyish trespass on Mr. What-d'ye-call-him's grounds at the back here, comes to the house for assistance this morning, and is immediately laid hold of and maltreated by that ingenious gentleman with the candle in his hand, who had placed his life in considerable danger, as I can professionally certify." Messrs. Blathers and Duff looked at Mr. Giles as he was thus recommended to their notice. The bewildered butler gazed from them towards Oliver, and from Oliver towards Mr. Losberne, with a most ludicrous mixture of fear and perplexity. "You don't mean to deny that, I suppose," said the doctor, laying Oliver gently down again. "It was all done for the best, sir," answered Giles. "I am sure I thought it was the boy, or I wouldn't have meddled with him. I am not of an inhuman disposition, sir." "Thought it was what boy?" inquired the senior officer. "The housekeeper's boy, sir," replied Giles. They certainly had a boy." "Well, do you think so now?" inquired Blathers. "Think what now?" replied Giles, looking vacantly at his questioner. "Think it's the same boy, stupid head," rejoined Blathers impatiently. I don't know. I really don't know," said Giles, with a rueful countenance. "I couldn't swear to him." "What do you think?" asked Mr. Blathers. "I don't know what to think," replied poor Giles. "I don't think it is the boy. Indeed, I'm almost certain that it isn't. You know it can't be." "Has this man been a-drinking, sir?" inquired Blathers, turning to the doctor. "What a precious muddle-headed chap you are," said Duff, addressing Mr. Giles with supreme contempt. Mr. Losberne had been feeling the patient's pulse during this short dialogue, but he now rose from the chair by the bedside, and remarked that if the officers had any doubts upon the subject, they would perhaps like to step into the next room and have Brittles before them. Acting upon this suggestion, they adjourned to a neighbouring apartment, where Mr. Brittles, being called in, involved himself and his respected superior in such a wonderful maze of fresh contradictions and impossibilities as tended to throw no particular light on anything but the fact of his own strong mystification, except indeed his declarations that he shouldn't know the real boy if he were put before him that instant, that he had only taken Oliver to be he because Mr. Giles had said he was, and that Mr. Giles had, 5 minutes previously, admitted in the kitchen that he begun to be very much afraid that he had been a little too hasty. Among other ingenious surmises, the question was then raised whether Mr. Giles had really hit anybody, and upon examination of the fellow pistol to that which he had fired, it turned out to have no more destructive loading than gunpowder and brown paper, a discovery which made a considerable impression on everybody but the doctor, who had drawn the ball about 10 minutes before. Upon no one, however, did it make a greater impression than Mr. Giles himself, who, after labouring for some hours under the fear of having mortally wounded a fellow creature, eagerly caught at this new idea and favoured it to the utmost. Finally, the officers, without troubling themselves very much about Oliver, left the Chertsey constable in the house, and took up their rest for that night in the town, promising to return the next morning. With the next morning there came a rumour that 2 men and a boy were in the cage at Kingston, who had been apprehended overnight under suspicious circumstances, and to Kingston Messrs. Blathers and Duff journeyed accordingly. The suspicious circumstances, however, resolving themselves on investigation into the one fact that they had been discovered sleeping under a haystack, which, although a great crime, is only punishable by imprisonment, and is, in the merciful eye of the English law and its comprehensive love of all the king's subjects, held to be no satisfactory proof, is the absence of all other evidence that the sleeper or sleepers have committed burglary accompanied with violence, and have therefore rendered themselves liable to the punishment of death. Messrs. Blathers and Duff came back again, as wise as they went. In short, after some more examination, and a great deal more conversation, a neighbouring magistrate was readily induced to take the joint bail of Mrs. Maylie and Mr. Losberne for Oliver's appearance if he should ever be called upon, and Blathers and Duff, being rewarded with a couple of guineas, returned to town with divided opinions on the subject of their expedition. The latter gentleman, on a mature consideration of all the circumstances, inclining to the belief that the burglarious attempt had originated from the family pet, and the former being equally disposed to concede the full merit of it to the great Mr. Conkey Chickweed. Meanwhile, Oliver gradually throve and prospered under the united care of Mrs. Maylie, Rose, and the kind-hearted Mr. Losberne. If fervent prayers gushing from hearts overcharged with gratitude be heard in heaven, and if they be not, what prayers are, the blessings which the orphan child called down upon them sunk into their souls, diffusing peace and happiness. End of chapter 31.